Hey there, students. Mr. Wolf here, and today we are going to be talking about, kind of recapping characterization for our short story unit right now. So right off the bat, let's go ahead and talk about what characterization is. And obviously characterization is a way in which an author develops a character, so like how they do that. So there are two types of characterizations. There is direct characterization, which is when the author directly states what the character's personality is like. So if they're cruel, they're kind. Also, what they look like and how they act and so on. So they were tall, they were blonde, they were green, purple, whatever, right? So direct characterization is when they tell you who this character is, what they look like, how they act, when they tell you all those things. Indirect characterization, which tends to be used a little bit more often, is all of the nuanced stuff, is all of the things where it's being shown the character's personality and even their looks and so on through their actions and words and feelings and other people's responses, the other characters' responses to them, and so on. So indirect characterization tends to be a bit more powerful. It gives us a little bit more investment. We infer things about them. It requires a little bit more mathematics, if you will, for the reader to identify certain things about the character. So they're nuanced. You have to definitely pay attention to the details. And again, that can happen in a variety of different ways. So in terms of the characterization elements, we have two categories, and there's two elements within those categories. So the first one is character detail, and we have our round characters. These are believable and realistic characters. They have a spectrum of qualities. They feel like somebody that you could meet or that you have met. You go, okay, I know who that person is, and I can infer a lot of things about them simply by knowing all these different elements or seeing the dynamics in this character, like that they are fleshed out and that they are human and that they have different emotions. Whereas a flat character is really a bit more of a non-believable character. They don't have a lot of characteristics, or they're limited to a few specific ones. Now, flat characters tend to, while they aren't always evil, right? Flat characters can absolutely be the sidekicks and so on of the main character. They don't have a lot of detail to them, and they maybe still really be likable characters to us. They may be someone that we really root for or that we like and we admire, but they don't really have much detail to them. So you could argue certain kinds of characters or certain characters are flat, like I just recently watched Lord of the Rings, and you could argue that Samwise Gamgee, as a faithful sidekick, we'll talk about that later, is kind of a flat character. He's always just a faithful sidekick, right? He does have different emotions, but for the most part, that's what he is, right? And he doesn't really change. So in a sense, he's a flat character. We show some dynamics when he gets disappointed, but he always comes back, and he's always faithful, and that's just, he's always looking out for Mr. Frodo's best, best interest and so on. So, with character development, we have the static character, which is the one that does not develop. They may be a person who is round and we understand a lot, but they don't really change. They're always pretty much staying the same. They don't transition or grow throughout the story, but they remain the same. And then we have the dynamic character. This is the one that starts from one place and ends up in some other. Now, a lot of the times this is our protagonist. There may be other characters that are this way, that are sub-characters, or even our antagonists sometimes can be dynamic. As somebody you see in the end who does turn, and they go, oh, I was always evil, and now I realize I was wrong, and I shouldn't have done that, So it is possible that our main character is static and round, and they don't really change, and there's usually certain scenarios for that type of thing. Or even our antagonist is a static and round character, or a static and flat character, and they're just evil and they're always just bad. I was written that way, and that's who I am, right? So obviously our dynamic characters tend to be a little bit more interesting, because we do see an evolution, but that's not always the case. Sometimes a static character plays a particular role, and they need to be there in that way. So there are other in terms of types of characters, we have our major characters, right? That's our protagonists. And our antagonist, those are the two main guys. Now, our protagonist is the person we're rooting for, right? The character of greatest importance to plot events and usually changes and is the good guy. So they're round and a dynamic character, usually. So to kind of break down protagonist as a word, pro or prot usually means first in favor of or for, right? So like think I'm pro this or I'm pro that, right? And then you have agon, which is means conflict, struggle, or contest, right? I'm trying to remember if it was Greek or Latin. It's probably Latin. Anyways, then there's the anti-hero, who is someone we want to see change or lack the traditional heroic characters. He or she is often doomed to failure. The anti-hero may be a person we still root for because they're anti-establishment or they're fighting the system somehow. But they're fundamentally a flawed character. They're somebody who doesn't really make a lot of good choices. But we understand why, because they usually are a very dynamic or a very round character. And they may not be dynamic. An anti-hero may not change, and that's one of the reasons why they may be doomed to failure, because we just like, oh, they just can't turn it around. And then we have our antagonist. It's pretty obvious. The character that is in direct conflict with the protagonist, anti meaning against, right? So antagonist meaning against this. So this is the person that is against the argument, or is against that contest that we want won by the protagonist, right? Now, to clarify this all, the protagonist and the antagonist, it's easy to think of them as people, right? There's the good guy and the bad guy. But we're going to find out, or we have found out, when we're talking about conflict, sometimes the antagonist is not a person. Quite frankly, sometimes the protagonist is not a person, right? Sometimes the protagonist is an animal or even an object or a force or something weird like that. I mean, authors do weird stuff, right? So, to be clear, the character isn't always necessarily a person. Sometimes the character is a thing or a force or something like that, right? But one way or another, it's keeping us. So if it's, if it's a character versus nature, antagonist is nature. Nature's the thing we're fighting against, right? Just to be clear on that. So when it comes to minor characters, these are of less significance. They come in many different forms, good and bad. I'm actually going to drop down to that bottom one. The stock and archetypal characters are commonly found characters and roles in stories that readers can easily identify and understand without much information. They often fulfill a specific role in the story. Most minor characters are those. So, going back up to the first one I have there, Faithful Sidekick, yeah, that's a stock character. So, they're meant to balance or support the shortcoming of the hero, often humanize them in the process. Hermione and Ron, Samwise, Han Solo, or at least Chewie for Han Solo, I guess you could say, is his faithful sidekick. But they're always there. They come in a clutch, and they're there to help out the main character when they're in their greatest need. And they're there also to demonstrate that the main character can't do it all on his own. Like that doesn't always make for a very interesting story when the main character has to do everything on their own. It helps to see that they do get help, because we all do need help, right? So faithful sidekick performs some of that role. And then there's the foil character. And the foil character, right, is that person who is kind of the opposite of oftentimes the protagonist or the main character, and they're there to highlight certain traits of the main character, and they can be shortcomings of the main character. For example, your foil character may be someone who's really cunning and really crafty, and the main character is just so darn innocent, they never really see it coming. And so they have to kind of wise up a little bit, and they have to realize, I have to be a little bit more skeptical. I can't just assume the goodness in everybody, and that some people are out there to cause harm, and so I need to learn that lesson. And so the foil character may be teaching them that lesson and that struggle that the main character has with them, or whatever. Sometimes our antagonist is our foil in some ways. So there's all sorts of other types of characters. There's the old wise man that like Gandalf, who has these special powers and shows up at the right time. And then there's the damsel in distress, and the comic relief, or the jokester characters, and all those types of ones. They're all minor characters that perform certain roles in the story to add dynamic and to help us understand what's going on. So, moving on from there, we're going to get into setting real quick. So, setting, simply put, right, is the time and place in which a story takes place. But there's a lot more to it, right? So when we're asking this question here, what can setting tell you about the story? Well, a lot, right? So let's dig into that just a little bit real quick. First off, setting gives you a frame in which the action and characters can work, right? So it's here's my frame, and I understand everything that can happen in that, right? We know what can and can't happen in the setting. We know who we will and won't meet in the setting as well. So can an author mess with this formula a little bit? Yeah, but if I'm doing like an old Western story and suddenly a dinosaur pops out of nowhere, I'm wondering what just happened, right? Unless suddenly we're dealing with a genre jump, which may happen. And by all means, we've had movies that do this all the time. But sometimes setting can dictate the genre, right? The setting itself. So if it's medieval times or something like that, maybe we're dealing with historical fiction. Or if we're on a space shuttle or another planet, we're like, okay, so science fiction, right? Setting is often a means to set the mood or even the conflict of the story, right? So when we're talking a dark and dreary night, right, it sets a mood like, ooh, it's kind of scary and, ominous. And or if it's a magical forest or an ogre swamp, we're like, okay, we're dealing with something like a fairy tale here, and we understand what's going to happen, and that there's hope built into the mood of the story, that there will be a conflict, there will be evil, but goodness will overcome, right?